A great river crosses French Laos, bringing life and wealth to this wonderful country. Descending from the high Tibetan massifs, the Mekong rolls its fertile waters, sometimes peacefully in rich valleys, sometimes furiously over chaotic rocks, crossing thresholds that seem to want to block its passage, but that its power has overcome, torn open. Great were the destinies of the Laotian people fixed on its backs, and great will be ours if we know how to conquer nature by science and men. We left off at the beginning of the French protectorate of Laos, which was secured by France's victory in the Franco-Siamese War of 1893. And with that, the treaty was signed, resulting in Siam's cession of the west of Laos, which included the kingdoms of Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak, to the French. So now that they have this huge piece of land, initially the French thought that they were going to make good profit from this land. So what was life like for the Laotians in the 1900s? Not much change, really. In fact, there wasn't much life in that area to begin with. So to understand this, we have to look at the Laotian geography and its environment. I'd also like to mention that before the French took control, Laos, although having a distinct ethnic identity, has been a vassal kingdom of Siam for about 115 years now, so much of their power and population has been diminished or some assimilated into Siam. It is not clear what the population of Laos was at the time. There are many estimates depending on all the different sources that I've looked at, but we all know for sure that it's really small. And the capital city at the time was in Luang Prabang. It wasn't really big either, compared to Siam, which had a population of around 7.3 million and a much larger capital city. And Luang Prabang today hasn't really changed much, but it looks nice. So once the French established themselves, they put a Governor General, Auguste Jean-Marie Pavie, in charge. Meanwhile, the Luang Prabang king still remained on the throne, though he didn't hold any real power. He was a puppet. And they moved the administrative capital to Vientiane in 1900. However, it is important to note that the annexation of Laos was merely seen as an extension of Vietnam. They administered it directly from Hanoi. This ties into the points that I mentioned earlier. Their presence was so small and insignificant, it seemed to the French that there wasn't any actual identity, national identity. In other words, to the French Empire, there wasn't really a Laos country. They was just expanding Vietnam. Not a lot of French people went to live in Laos because it was in the middle of nowhere and there was the risk of malaria. Most of the colonial administration was in Luang Prabang or Vientiane. Earlier on, there wasn't much urban renovation, but plantations and houses were built for the French administrators. They made the locals grow crops like opium and coffee for them. I guess you can say that there was not much difference in the grand scheme of things. You'll keep hearing this, but development in Laos came very slowly. That's because France didn't want to invest in it, nor did they want to do anything with it. And they didn't know what to do with it. Laos was dubbed the colonial backwater, as it was the least developed area in French Indochina, and it generated the lowest revenue. I think that's the word. So anyways, it was isolated in the middle of the mountains, and it was surrounded by rivers. Not much was explored at all, as getting from places to place in this country was difficult. However, luckily there still exist some first-hand accounts from French travelers from this really useful book, Empire colonial de la France, l'Indochine, Cochinchine, Cambodge, Laos, Annam, Tonkin. French photographer Jules Gervais Gutermont writes about his trip to the French Indochina. It's originally published in 1901, which is perfect because I'm covering this period now. There are many interesting reports in it, though reading through the Laos chapter, the descriptions of life is just as one would expect to hear. So I'm gonna read. Laotian women work more than men. To them fall the care of the household, of the kitchen, of the pigsty, of the farmyard. To them the care of husking from dawn the rice which one will eat that day, and improvised carriage of children. That's this right here. The men are responsible for tending the gardens and watering them in the dry season, fetching water from the river, sowing, pricking out, transplanting, weeding, and harvesting rice in the rainy season. The men plow, harrow, and prepare the rice fields, go fishing and hunting, drive the pirogues and the trade in the distance. The rest of the time, often 6 months out of 12, they rest. The women work all year round, for it is still they who reel the silk, spin the cotton, and weave the cloth that the family trades or dresses in. But all this is done cheerfully, without haste, in the great joy of living. On account of that, daily life of the local people did not change much, but for those who lived close enough to the French administrators, it wasn't looking too good. Heavy taxes were imposed on the locals, who couldn't pay it as they had no money. Moreover, the French administered the corvée system, which, if we recall from class 9, was a sort of forced unpaid labor that went on for a few days annually. The laborers had to build roads and other infrastructure. Though it may not seem like much, just a few days a year, this was an act of abuse, and soon resentment built up on the locals' parts. Now, I realize that it's already been 7 minutes, and we're gonna have to move on to a different topic, but I shall provide some slides in the description, and you can look through them. I do go into the creation of modern Laos and France's attempts to detach Laos from Siam. And we also have other first-hand accounts of what life was like. Anyways, Laotian history is confusing, so there are a couple of important figures that we need to know about. So, we're gonna move on to that.
Moving on to the important people during this period, there are a number of important French and Laotian people. Ernest Marc Louis de Gonzague d'Audat de la Grey was the leader of the French Mekong expedition of 1866 to 1868. This was the expedition that led the French from Vietnam to Cambodia to Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar into China's Yunnan province and finally Shanghai. He was born in Saint Vincent de Maquis near Grenoble, France, and graduated from the Ecole Polytechnique. He joined the Navy and served in the Crimean War. After that, he took up a post in Indochina in the hope that the climate would help him his ecologically isolated throat. It did not, and throughout the Mekong expedition, he was often in severe pain. Alexander Henry Mohot was a French naturalist and explorer of the mid-19th century. He was born in Montauban, Laos, France, near the Swiss border, but spent his childhood in Russia and possibly parts of Asia. He was the first European to visit the royal Laotian city of Luang Prabang. Auguste Jean-Marie Pavie was a French colonist, civil servant, explorer, and a diplomat who was instrumental in establishing French control over Laos in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. After a long career in Cambodia and Cochin China, which was another name for Vietnam, Pavie became the first French vice consul in Luang Prabang in 1886, eventually becoming the first general governor and plenipotentiary minister and of the newly formed French colony of Laos. King Sakhalin was the king of Luang Prabang from 1895 to 1904. In 1888, the king of Siam appointed him regent for his father. Sakhalin officially succeeded his father on December 15, 1895, and was crowned at Luang Prabang on 14 July 1896. During his reign, he was forced to accept a French protectorate over the kingdom. On 3rd October 1893, after his father agreed to having French protection, he was basically a puppet for the French. Ongkel of Bhumibol was a Lao leader who led a rebellion against the French. He launched his rebellion in Tai Teng in response to the destruction of the temple of Ban Dong Meng. This rebellion lasted 6 years before a truce could be made. Ong Keo surrendered to the French in October 1907 after military defeats, epidemics, and famine disheartened his troops. Despite his surrender, he never submitted to the conditions that the French laid on him. He continued to use the title of Great King that he had given himself, perform Buddhist religious rites, and encourage his discipline. Politically, Ong commanded them to carry out his struggle. In 1910, the French Commissioner of Sarawak, Jean-Jacques D'Aupre, ordered that he be killed for his arrogant attitude. After his death, fighting still continued under his successor, Ong Commandam, until at least 1937. Ong Commandam was the confidant and the successor of Ong Keo as the leader of Mon Khmer of southern Laos in the struggle for independence from French and Lao rule. Ong Keo was assassinated in 1910 by the Commissioner of Sarawak. Condemned survived attack, which added to his status, and he united the highland minorities of southern Laos. He invented the secret script to convey messages, the Calm script. He continued to fight for independence from 1910 until 1936, and then he was killed.
To start with, Laos was under colonization since the 19th century, dominantly under the French protectorate. King Si Sawangwong, who initially was a king of Luang Prabang, was in favor of the French. Evidence of their close relations was shown when the French had built the royal palace of Luang Prabang for King Si Sawangwong, where he used it for his residence. After a short occupation of Japanese power in 1945, a contradiction began to rise within the country, especially in the ruling class. But before we explore the conflict, I would like to give you some detail about Laos' position associated with Japanese and the French. In March 1945, Japan was able to control Laos and forced King Si Sawangwong to declare Laos independence over the French protectorate, and the king agreed to do so. But soon after, the French successfully returned back in power, resulting in the departure of Japanese. Therefore, the return of the French brought up a division between pro-French and anti-French among the ruling class. The conflict began when King Si Sawangwong supported the return of the French, but Prince Pesarat did not. Prince Pesarat therefore formed a provisional government in Vientiane, so-called Lao Isala. Its political aim was to oppose the French restoration, and this movement signaled a kind of nationalism towards colonization. Soon after, French were back and Lao Isala began to dissolve, which later became known as Lao Government in Exile. The members were exiled and had to flee to Thailand, including Prince Pesarat. Even though Lao Isala did not last that long, it has already paved the way for Laos to anti-colonization ideas. More details about Prince Pesarat Ratanaphon. Since he was an important figure in establishing Lao Isala, he then was considered as a Lao nationalist and one of the political leaders, even though his position remained as a prince. Other important leaders of Lao Isala were Prince Suphanuvong and Suvarnabhuma. Due to short-lived existence, some members and ideologies began to separate into other factions. One of the most well-known was a formation of Pathet Lao. So now, we have two names of political movements during this time, Lao Isala and Pathet Lao. Because Lao Isala did not gain much success, some aristocrats and Lao elites began to turn into the French in order to preserve their stability and still independence of Laos. In contrast, some joined communist factions, which gained support from Vietnamese communists. Prince Suphanuvong, who played a crucial role helping to form Pathet Lao, relied on communist support and later drove Laos into more communist society. Prince Suphanuvong also was named as a Red Prince because of tourism. He was a royal blood and also helped to promote the rise of communism. A formation of Pathet Lao not only rejected the French protectorate, but also the existence of the monarch. The Franco-Laos Treaty of 1953 gave full independence to the Kingdom of Laos. Now, Laos' colonization issue was relieved, but other problems began to take place when there was no clear declarations for who would run the country after it gained independence. King Srisawangwattana, who succeeds the throne after his father, King Srisawangwong, asked three princes to form a coalition government. These three princes refer to three well-known figures of royal buds associated with different political viewpoints. First, Prince Suvarnabhuma, who was represented as a neutralist from the royal government. Next, Prince Nachampasak, who was represented as the right-wing politician. He was kind of pro-Western figure because he supported the French. However, still remained in opposition to Japanese occupation. Lastly, Prince Suvarnabhumi, who brought about communism into Laos and led the Pathet Lao movement, which later became known as Lao People's Revolutionary Party. During 1960s and 1970s, Pathet Lao fought over the Royal Laos government. Pathet Lao held the victory with support of communist alliances such as the Soviet Union and North Vietnam, resulting in an overthrow of the royal family, and the King Srisawangwattana was forced to abdicate. Therefore, King Srisawangwattana was the last king of the Kingdom of Laos. After the collapse of the royal government in 1975, Pathet Lao formed a new government known as Laos People Democratic Republic or Lao People Revolutionary Party, appointing Prince Suvarnabhumi as a president or a head of the state, and Kaisorn Phomvihan as the first prime minister of the party. They not only abolished monarchy but also capitalism and imperialism. The new government significantly attempted to impose and promote socialism, which was adopted from Marxism and Leninism. The party aimed at promoting collectivization and economic reconstruction due to destruction of the society and ideology after those turbulent times. Next, we'll explore about foreign affairs between Laos and other countries, including China and India. For China, according to what China Actor stated in Journal of Current Chinese Affairs, numbers of Chinese immigration decreased by the end of colonialism in 1947 compared to other neighboring countries. Overseas Chinese was about 2.5 million in Thailand, 1.9 million in Dutch India, 300,000 in Burma, 850,000 in French Indochina. But in Laos, there were only 32,500 Chinese who were registered. A small number of Chinese community might be understood for two reasons. First, Laos was landlocked, whereas other countries such as Thailand and Cambodia were much easier to transport. And it might be because Vietnamese provide cheaper labors than Laos and Chinese people, so that the French during that time support more of the Vietnamese. Since India and Laos had shared some culture and value together, Buddhism was held as a mainstream religion to Laos people. Indian cultures and beliefs such as Hinduism and Theravada of Buddhism had also influence on Laos society. Additionally, both of their political views were similarly clear to relying on non-aligned movements. It meant that they would give no support to any sides in fighting the wars. This was before the Lao Revolution in 1975. After this, the new government, which was formed by the Pathet Lao, began to rely more on Vietnam and other communist sides. Lao and Indian relationship was gradually dissolved.
How was Laos affected by World War I? Lao kingdoms under French colonial rule. By 1914, Laos had been under French colonial rule for less than 30 years after a period of conquest that lasted from the 1860 to the 1880 and had been under a common general budget since 1898. French Indochina, popularly known as the Indochinese Union, in 1887 was a French colonial state. The colonial power was always concerned about the potential of rebellions throughout Indochina. The French goal was to remove and exile the monarchs and their allies, replacing them with younger princes who were to be trained to be pro-French and easily controlled. Therefore, the King of Laos, Sisawang Pulivong, in 1885 to 1959, who trained at the Lindsay Chassis Loop Rabat, Saigon, Vietnam, and at the Eco Colonial Paris, was also crowned in 1904 in Luang Prabang. The French built him a new place, and a new agreement in 1917 only allowed him to display official signs of loyal power. Indochina, Laos during World War I, uprisings and conflict during the Great War. An anti-French rebellion took place among the Thai Lu in Laos. From 1914 to 1917, Unionists from Black River region sacked a French post in Sam Nun, and insurgents came with Chinese Republic flags and appeared to be well informed about the European conflict. Anti-colonial parties and political radicalization in the French migration was one of the primary drivers of political radicalization in France during World War I. The great experience of living in France allowed them to observe French vulnerability when faced with German enemies, as well as major changes in French politics. After the Bolshevik Revolution in Laos, Colonial Administrator Paul Boulanger observed that Upper Laos was aggregated from 1914 to 1921. The effect: Southeast Asia was colonized by European powers, so the French had colonized in the present is Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. That was called French Indochina. Laos is the one of the countries that colonized. People in Laos concerned within the war. It was amazing to many people who opposed colonialism. Therefore, Laos did not affect the outcome of the war on the Western Front. But that the war had a major impact all over Southeast Asia as trade and people and alliances. In conclude, economic problems were a constant throughout the region. The French and the British were forced to raise taxes in their Southeast Asian possessions to exit from the war effort, and the underprivileged bore the brunt of the strain. It's not surprised that there were massive protests. And the next, how was Laos affected by World War II? Laos during World War II. Laos, the protectorate, briefly proclaimed independence under Japanese occupation in 1945. Japan destroyed French sovereignty over its Indochinese territories, and a considerable number of French officials in Laos were imprisoned. As the result, King Sisawang was compelled to declare Laotian independence and join the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Therefore, France grabbed on Laos' first slip in 1945 when the Japanese occupied Laos in the closing days of World War II. After the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, Prince Prasarath Rao Isla Free Laos government declared independence. The French regained power the following year. French was Laos colonized. In 1893, Laos became a French protectorate until 1945, when it is briefly occupied by the Japanese towards in the end of World War II. After that, in 1946, French rule over Laos is resumed, and then in 1950, Laos is granted semi-autonomy as an associated state within the French Union. Moreover, under the French rule, the Vietnamese were encouraged to migrate to Laos, which was seen by the French colonists as a rational solution to a practical problem within the confines of an Indochina-wide colonial space. There were two effects in Laos during World War II. The first is the rise of Laotian nationalism during World War II. Laos was merged into the French Indochinese Federation by the French, who gave the nation its own government and national assembly. The Vietnamese government fell to Pathet Lao and Northern Vietnam's mixed forces before the conclusion of the Civil War in 1975, and the movement's leaders consolidated their authority and founded a new government that is still a power in today. The second is Laos movement. WWII, also known as English Free Laos, is a Laotian political movement that was created in 1945 to resist French colonial rule. After the Japanese left Laos, the Laotian governing class was split. French sovereignty should be restored. The Viceroy Prince Prasarath and his brothers Sovana, Poma, and Sopanawong were major members of the non-communist WWII, which decided to complete independence. The WWII was split when partial independence was granted inside the French Union in 1949, with one group forming the left-wing Pathet Lao. The United States war in Laos was key to the birth of a military CIA. In Laos, the United States dropped more bombs than it did in all of World War II, America's decade-and-a-half war in Laos in stunning detail. The CIA's evolution from an intelligence gathering to a war-fighting institution. The CIA benefited greatly from the conflict in Laos because it expanded its bureaucratic image and increased its funding. As a result, by the end of the war, the CIA had established itself as a major role in the Washington establishment. The United States' aim as the war went on was to use Laos as a canal house, where most of the reason for the fight was to occupy North Vietnamese army. Overall, despite its substantial force, the deployment of uniformed military people can allow for better control by Congress and the public.
When atomic bombs fell on Japan, Laos declared its independence under the short-lived Lao Isara government of Prince Pesalat in 1945. The French regained power the following year. Laos achieved full independence in 1954, following the victory of Communist Viet Minh leader Ho Chi Minh over the French at the bloody Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The ensuing Geneva Accords split Vietnam into North and South Vietnam, and stipulated that the French relinquish their claims in Southeast Asia. The agreement was not signed by the United States, who feared that in the absence of French influence, Southeast Asia would fall to Communist forces. The United States watched closely as the Pathet Lao gained popularity in newly independent Laos. The Pathet Lao was a communist group founded at Viet Minh headquarters in 1950 during the French War. Largely dependent on Vietnamese aid, their leader was Prince Supuk Mahamat, the late Prince, born to be a prince of Luang Prabang and a commoner. His education in Vietnam led him to be a disciple of Ho Chi Minh and later to lead the opposition against his half-brother Suvarnabhuma, who was Prime Minister of Laos 5 different times and preferred a coalition government balancing the Pathet Lao with more conservative forces. Phuma's hold on power was tenuous at best. Under his rule, government troops and Pathet Lao began to clash in the northeast along the border of Vietnam. Publicly, President Kennedy announced his support for neutralizing Laos, though what neutralization looks like on paper was far different from what it was in practice. A ground war in Laos with U.S. forces was not on the table. President Kennedy wrote as early as 1961 that Laos is a most inhospitable area in which to wage a campaign. Its geography, topography, and climate are built-in liabilities. Bombing Laos was seen as a safer means for cutting off communist supply lines into Vietnam before they could be used against American troops. The U.S. Air Force began bombing targets in Laos in 1964, flying planes full of cluster bombs on convoy mission based out of Thailand. The United States eventually dropped the equivalent of plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years, according to Al Jazeera. The bombing focused on disrupting communist supply chains on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and Saipon, a village near a former French airbase now controlled by North Vietnam. In 1971, Saipon was the target of failed Operation Lam Son, when the US and South Vietnam attempted to block access to Ho Chi Minh Trail. Dave Burns, a member of the US Air Force 16 Special Operations Squadron, flew mission over Laos out of Ubon, Thailand. He recalls, Saipon was the one place in Laos that we did not want to fly into. The village was as crossroads of 3 highways leading in from Vietnam, the Muk Ye Pass, the Ban Karai Pass, and the Pathem Pass. The highways then headed south to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was highly defended with all sorts of anti-aircraft guns. Going there was a guarantee of being hit or being shot down. By 1975, 1/10 of the population of Laos, or 200,000, were wiped out. Twice as many were wounded, 750,000, a full quarter of the population had become refugees, including General Wang Pao himself. Declassified documents show that 728 Americans died in Laos, most of whom were working for the CIA. In Laos, the legacy of US bombs continued to wreak havoc. Since 1964, more than 50,000 Laos have been killed or injured by US bombs. In 2016, President Barack Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Laos. He pledged an additional $19 million in aid to remove unexploded ordnance on top of the $100 million that had been spent previously. The work of cleaning out unexploded bombs from the soils continues. World War II helped stimulate Laotian nationalism, which arose in response to an aggressive Thailand and occupation by Japanese forces. Laos was not much affected by the war until early 1945, when Japanese troops took control of the WWII French colonial regime and forced the Lao king Sasaluk to declare independence. The French reasserted control of Laos in 1946, implementing a constitutional monarchy while working to improve infrastructure, particularly in transport and education. Despite these advances, this period was marked by frustration with foreign interference in Laotian affairs. In 1957, the Pathet Lao was invited to form a coalition government. This coalition collapsed the following year under pressure from the United States, which was suspicious of Pathet Lao's communist ties. This helped reignite the Laotian civil war between US-backed loyal government and the Pathet Lao, which was supported and supplied by Hanoi and Moscow. By the late 1950s, much of northern and eastern Laos was controlled by the Pathet Lao. During this period, the North Vietnamese military entered Laos to establish the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a remote track for people and supply the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. An agreement signed in Geneva 1962 produced another coalition government and a pause in the civil war, though both lasted scarcely a year. During the 1960s, the Pathet Lao, supported by the North Vietnamese, fought for control against the Laotian loyal government and the Athid Morasuk, both of whom were backed by the US. Despite American involvement, the Pathet Lao continued to make gains. Through 1968, a succession of communist advances scattered the loyal Lao army, reducing it to barely 1,000 men. Much of northern Laos was controlled by the Pathet Lao, the NVA, and Viet Cong, which used Laotian territory for transporting men and supply to South Vietnam. An intensification of U.S. bombing stalled some communist advances, but when the Americans ceased their bombing runs in February 1973, the Pathet Lao, now bolstered by greater number and weaponry from Hanoi, began to expand. A ceasefire was signed, and in April 1973, another coalition government formed. The Loyalists and Pathet Lao enjoyed equal representation in this new administration. Between mid-1973 and early 1975, however, the Pathet Lao engaged in a creeping takeover of the national government. In April 1975, as the North Vietnamese were moving towards Saigon, Pathet Lao forces began moving towards Viet Vienne. They were infiltrated by Pathet Lao officials and supporters. The government offered little meaningful resistance. With the fall of the Viet Vienne imminent, thousands of Americans, foreigners, and loyalist supporters fled across the border to Thailand. By August, the Pathet Lao was in virtual control of the country. Its seizure of power was formalized on December 2, 1975, with the abolition of the government, the abdication of King Sawang Wattana, and the formation of Laos People's Democratic Republic. The Pathet Lao's earlier promise of elections, democratic reform, and liberal freedoms were quickly forgotten, as the new regime moved to silence dissident and established a one-party state. Today, Laos is one of the world's last remaining socialist states. Its government is dominated by the Lao People's Revolutionary Party, or LPRP, the political arm of the Pathet Lao. Other parties and factions are banned. Significant policies are formulated and approved by the LPRP's Politburo. There is an elected legislature, the National Assembly. However, only LPRP members are permitted to stand as candidates, and elections are probably rigged. Unlike Hanoi, Laos' communist regime did not sever ties with the United States. The American embassy in Vientiane continued to operate during and after 1975. As in Vietnam, the Laotian government began to slowly liberalize during 1990s. In August 1991, the LPRP approved a new constitution that acknowledged Laos' ethnic diversity and individual rights for its citizens. Economic development has been slower. Laos' economy is dominated by agriculture, mining, and international tourism, which has grown remarkably in the past decade. The people of Laos remain desperately poor, with 2 million living below the international poverty line and hunger a widespread problem.
Around about 1975, several communist governments were established in Indochina, which these countries included Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. So, major countries like the United States, Australia, and the UK experienced a huge surge of immigration from Indochina. And Thailand also welcomed about 500,000 Laotian refugees and also Cambodians. This is important because these people are living among us, and they've experienced all of these. That includes my maternal side of the family. In this section of the video, we're going to listen to a short interview from my grandmother, who basically lived through the Laotian Civil War. She experienced everything from the bombings to the attacks from Congolese forces in the Battle of Vientiane. But here she'll be talking about how she escaped the communist government in 1975 to Thailand. ทำอาชีพอะไรคะ
เกษตรกร
แล้วทำไมยายถึงหนีมาประเทศไทยเหรอคะ
ก็กลัวเนาะกลัวสงครามไหมตอนนี้
แล้วปีก่อนหน้าที่เขาหนีกันนะคะประเทศลาวเขาโดนระเบิดของอเมริกา
เขาก็เฮ็ดหลุมลบไผ่แม่สู้สิเขาขุดหลุมแบบลบไผ่เห็นไหมย่ายก็ได้เขาไปอยู่เด้หลุมลบไผ่ยันลบไผ่หันยันอันลูกระเบิดตกใส่แต่ว่าก็แก้วขาดมาได้แบบนี้
หนูอยากให้ยายเล่าแบบละเอียดเลยนะคะเหตุการณ์ที่ยายลอยน้ำมาจากแม่น้ำโขงถึงฝั่งของเมืองไทยอะค่ะ
ขี่เรือมาเลยขี่เรือแล้วก็ขามมันนี่เป็นดอนแม้เป็นดอนเป็นเกาะนะเป็นเกาะนะเขาเรียกเกาะแล้วอุ้มลูกไปอันลี่อยู่ทึ่งอันหน้ายังหน้าเขาปลูกไว้เกาะหันถ้าอ้อมน้อยๆเดือนกับหามือบอกญาติลูกให้เอามือปิดปากลูกไว้เพราะว่าพวกทหารคอมมิวนิสต์นี่เขาสิเดินสำรวจย่ำขึ้นตาเห็นนี่เขาสิขาทิ้งได้เพราะขาเขากระจับไปเนี่ยเขาจับนี้เลย
แล้วอันนั้นตอนนั้นเราแอบอยู่ไหนคะ
แอบอยู่ทั้งเถียงหน้าแม่อยู่ทั้งกระท่อมเขาแม่กระท่อมเขาเฮ็ดไปเขาเฮ็ดสวนปลูกสวนลำไยแม่ปลูกโน่นปลูกนี่แม่ย่ายจำได้เมื่อเขายิ่งคนตายคนกันลอยน้ำมากกับมี่เขายิ่งตายเลยขี้ง่ามากคนกันลอยไปนิดลอยขามได้แบบนี้แม่
ตาเขาไปลงที่หนองคาย
น้องค่ายตาน่ะเขาขามน้องค่ายตำรวจได้จับเขาติดตารางไว้
นนตำรวจ
ย่ายกับยูพี่ย่ายกับมิญาติพี่น้องมาเอาแล้วไปอยู่น้ำพี่น้องขอนแก่นไปลอยขามฟังไปที่เชียงใหม่เขาเลยจับเลยตกล่มกุหลาบสีเชียงใหม่นะแล้วสีเชียงใหม่เขาจับไปค่ายเลยใส่คุกไว้หลายคนก็มีแต่ตาดอกวันนี้หน้าแม่นาคำพันเขาเลยไปประกาศออกมาเลยไปหาย่ายอยู่บ้านอยู่ขอนแก่นบ้านญาติเนี่ย
มันมีครอบครัวอีกส่วนหนึ่งที่เขาไปต่างประเทศใช่ไหมคะยาย
จ้าก็ไอ้บางคนเขาก็ไปต่างประเทศเลยเขาไปไว้ศูนย์ไหมทุกสิเอาเขาจับไปไว้ศูนย์หลายเป็นลอยๆครอบครัวพวกนั้นเขาส่งไปตาเขาว่าไปเขาเรียกสิมาหาครอบครัวเขาหาย่ายกับลูกเขาเลยว่าไปเขาถามอยู่ตาว่าไปเขาไปอยู่นอกเลยกับมีเท่าทุกมือเนี่ยแหละ
ก็
เข้าใจปะ
ก็ได้ข้อมูลทั้งหมดแล้วที่ต้องการที่จะรู้นะคะก็ขอบคุณนะคะยาย
Within the world of balancing power, we can assume that every state seeks security and stability in sovereignty for their own countries. After the period of Cold War, the concept of security started to slowly shift from state-centered to individual. However, within this bipolar world order, China remained solid to their identity in communism. The rise of this superpower nation can pose a threat to the future of the newly rebalanced world order after the period of Cold War. In the anarchic world of international politics, it is better to be Godzilla than Bambi. This is the quote from American political scientist John J. Mearsheimer, who viewed world's political and international relations through the perspective of realism. He believes that maximizing power is a way to survive in the anarchic world system. In his theory of China rising in power, it evolved around 5 assumptions, which are: the international system is anarchy, which means there is no higher power above to control or secure any states. All states possess offensive military capabilities. States can never be certain of others' intentions. States seek to maintain their survival above all other goals. And finally, states are rational actors. They think strategically of both short and long-term consequences of their actions. So the idealistic form of security within the world of realism is to become a regional hegemony, and that seemed to be the goal for China. So China practiced relative powers. Becoming a regional hegemony is equal to maximizing survivability in an anarchic world. With security and stability or efficiency in ability to roam free, it gives states huge expanding power, just like in the period of colonization. And through economic binding, or creating economic dependency, it gives countries a leverage in powers. So the first skepticism on China rise is communism supports. China has a clear history of supporting and promoting communism through materials and military supports, whether it is going to be in the proxy wars in Laos, Vietnam, or even Korea. So China has been supporting and promoting socialist communism movement for the Pathet Lao liberation groups. Even though China only provides indirect supports through materials, weapons, and trainings, however, the Pathet Lao managed to win over the whole nations from the Kingdom of Lao party. From this incident and the Khmer Rouge, the West worried that China might potentially cause a communism domino effect throughout Southeast Asia region. Second is military aggression and uncertainty. Apart from having a military spending outweigh its governmental spending, China seemed to be practicing and advancing military technologies even in times of peace. Moreover, the country has their history of enclosing and keeping away their internal affairs from the global stage. For example, China possessed a weapon that ranged above its territory into Taiwan, claiming that it is an internal affairs of their country. Not only ambiguous military strategy, but China power can also be explored through the perspective of economic manipulation for countries with lesser leverage, to eventually restrain their country to bid for its regional hegemon. For example, the case of Hambantota port of Sri Lanka. The country has borrowed the money from Exim Bank of China to construct the port, which lead the country to be in debt with China. And eventually, 70% of port stock was leased to China Merchant Ports Holding Company for a whopping number of 99 years, or an equivalent to $1.12 billion. Moreover, China do have a history of favoring currency manipulation. The country would alter its currency to go undervalued in order to increase more export from the country, in order to compete with another great power like the United States.
Moving on to Laos and the United States diplomatic relations. As the United States established full diplomatic relations with Laos in 1955, after Laos received independence from France in 1954. However, Laos was badly hit by the United States as a part of the Indochina War for nearly a decade, beginning in 1964. A communist government came into power in Lao People's Democratic Republic, also known as Lao PDR. The government allied with Vietnam and the Soviet Union, in which instituted one-party rule and a centralized government economy. As a result, the relationship between Laos and the United States deteriorated. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Lao PDR had to make an ally and strengthen the relationship with other countries as well as to improve the economy. And up until 1992, the relationship between the United States and Laos was restored. And in July 2012, Secretary of the State Hillary Clinton visited the Lao PDR, making the first visit by a Secretary of State since 1955. President Barack Obama became the first U.S. president visited in September 2016 when he and Laos President Punyang Vorachit announced a comprehensive partnership. The United States and the Lao PDR continue to broaden cooperation on a range of issues including health, child nutrition, education, environmental protection, trade liberalization, legal reform, counter-narcotics, law enforcement cooperations, humanitarian assistance, and English language training. The expansion in cooperation accelerated in 2009 with the launch of the Lower Mekong Initiative and the 2016 establishment of the U.S. and Laos Comprehensive Partnership, and will continue to grow with the new Mekong-U.S. Partnership, which was initiated in 2020. Moreover, the United States and the Lao PDR share a commitment to ensuring a prosperous and sustainable future for the Mekong sub-region. They also continue to resolve war legacy issues, including clearance of exploded ordnance and accounting for missing American personnel. On April 8, 2019, President Donald J. Trump formally accepted the qualifications of Ambassador Kampan Elawan, the new Lao ambassador to the United States, at the White House in Washington, D.C. The combined total of both shipments of the vaccine this year, 2022, is almost 1,700,000 doses. This contribution from the United States will support Lao PDR efforts towards its goal of vaccinating 80% of its population by the end of 2022, and will contribute to the COVAX facility's mission of ensuring global equitable access to COVID-19 vaccine during the pandemic. In a part of bilateral economic relations, since the U.S.-Laos bilateral trade agreement in 2005, the United States granted Laos products normal trade relations status, formerly known as Most Favored Nation or MFN. The Lao PDR is considered as one of the fastest growing economies in the regions, and expects the strong recovery from the COVID-19 pandemics. The U.S. exports to the Lao PDR include the metals, vehicles, and agricultural products. At the same time, the U.S. imports include apparel, inorganic chemicals, agricultural products, and precious metals. Moving on to Laos and the UK relations. The UK and Laos first established diplomatic relations on 5 September 1955. Diplomatic relations were reinvigorated in November 2012 with the official reopening of the British Embassy in Vientiane after the diplomatic absence of 27 years, and further strengthened by the reopening of the Embassy of the Lao PDR in London 2014. Mr. Pongsawan Sisulat, who currently serves as Lao Ambassador in UK, and this is John Pearson, who currently serves as British Ambassador in Laos. The ambassador roles in both countries will involve enhancing various aspects, including education, cooperation, trade and investment, tourism, and Lao border foreign policy. Based on the Globe.uk website and the UK in Laos Facebook page, there are a lot of activities such as development policy, the celebration of diplomatic relations, education, etc. Those were done by the cooperation between Laos and the UK. There was a Lao association in the UK which is called LAUK. The Lao Association in the UK was formed in 1980. Its aims are to promote charitable purposes for Lao people living in the UK, including the advancement of education and the relief of poverty and distress. By looking at the cooperation between the UK and Laos during the COVID-19 pandemic, since 2021, the UK has contributed facilities to Laos, which includes science funding, vaccines, and etc. This is another UK contribution to the response to COVID-19 in Laos. Moving on to the cultural influences among those countries. But firstly, the dance and music was begun by the loyal musicians and dancers from Luang Prabang, immigrated as refugees and moved to the United States, where they were resettled as a group in Nashville, Tennessee. And those from the Nathan School, which also called as the National School of Dramatic Arts, near Vientiane, similarly were sent to Des Moines in Iowa. Next is the Laotian American. Laotian immigration to the U.S. started shortly after the Vietnam War. Refugees began alive in the U.S. after the communist government came into power in Laos in 1975. By mentioning values, many Laotian Americans have retained the values they brought with them from their homeland, such as the practice of Buddhism, and as Laotian American children were expected to respect and care for their parents throughout their adult life. Last but not least, the Laotian cuisine, which the famous one is the sticky rice. Second is Tam Lao, or Laotian-style green papaya salad. The last one is Lao sausages, which most Lao restaurants in the UK and the US serve these menus to the customers.